Well, I'm glad to be joined by George Yancey, who needs no introduction, but is a scholar, teaches at Baylor University, and is author of several books. And I wanted to have him come on the show to talk about some of his work. George, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So, George, I think I first heard or read you years ago when you had a book on what you called Christianophobia, a sort of anti-Christian sentiment that you found both sort of in the West, but in academia. And I just have been reading your stuff ever since. But maybe share a little bit of your story in terms of how you came to kind of write on some of the important cultural and social things going on in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it just depends on what we're talking about. Like on Christianophobia, it was partially my observation being a Christian in academia, but also I remember I was watching a presentation of someone trying to show that this was not a problem, and I had serious problems with his methodology. I said, well, no, if you're going to look at it, you need to do this, this, and this, and so a couple of years later, I did this, this, and this, and I wound up with a book or two out of it. So now, as concerns race, I think that's a little bit different story. You know, obviously, as an African American, I feel it pretty much so, but I've never been really angry at it. And in my book, I tell about the turning point in my life where I realized that there are some things that I encounter as an African American that I cannot overcome. And that was a broken relationship. So that was a turning point that got me interested in studying race. And so that's that was like 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I think is interesting, George, about your work is I don't think this is intentional necessarily, but I feel like when you write and you speak, you're sort of I know the concept of a third way is sort of dismissed these days by all sides, but I do feel like you're trying to find ways to bring people together on some of these issues. Has that always kind of been your posture when studying these things? That how do we have these conversations with people who come at it from such different perspectives?
Yeah, I think on racial issues, it really has been. Because I can see a lot of different sides. I've talked to people in different camps and really talk to them, not just talk at them, so that I can understand where they're coming from and, concede, hey, you know what, you got a good point here. And so I think if we had more understand why people believe what they believe, even if we don't agree with them, it gives more compassion so that we'll want to work with them. And so that's been something that I think ever since I really dived into race, that's what I really wanted to do.
Yeah, I really appreciated your latest book, Beyond Racial Division, a unifying alternative to colorblindness and AntiRacism. I'm working on a book project on Christian unity that's coming out next year, and I have a chapter on race, and I read quite a few books because I have a similar desire, though I have not studied it at all to the extent that you have, of the idea that I feel like there's a lot of folks who are talking past each other. We're sort of polarized into our separate sort of camps, and it is kind of furthered polarization. And so I found your book really refreshing in many ways. And it seems like there's a genre of folks who are trying to do this. In the last year or so, your book has been very helpful from a methodological and sociological standpoint and theological standpoint. I've read a few others like Derwin Gray's book on anti-racial division, and Isaac Adams is kind of a pastoral book. Shai Lin has a new book out as well called The New Reformation, kind of taking a similar approach. But I want to talk a little bit about your book. You kind of raise two equal and opposite, as you kind of phrase them, damaging or maybe false sort of polarities. One is this idea of colorblindness, and the other one, the idea of sort of this, the sort of mainstream anti-racism movement. Do you want to briefly kind of share why you feel both of those movements, both of those, I wouldn't say movements, both of those tendencies hurt our racial conversations?
So just I'll briefly define them so people know what we're talking about. Colorblindness is the notion that we deal with race by ignoring race. We deal with race by saying, I don't see race. Anti-racism, we've had a lot of anti-racism books come out, and among its tenets is this notion that whites need to do what people of color want them to do. And that comes out in a lot of these books. And I can go into that if people disagree with me, but, it's hard to find an anti-racism book that doesn't have that as one of its themes. So, they both say different things. Now, here's the sort of ironic part. I think they both fail for the same reason, even though they go in different directions. I think they both fail because both of them basically say, look, I have the answer. What you need to do is do what I say is the answer, and then we'll have racial harmony. Well, you can always have harmony if people, if you can be Professor X and make everyone do exactly what you want, then yeah, you have harmony. But we don't live in that sort of world, and so expecting people to do what you want and get harmony that way is not going to work in this world. I think there's a scriptural reason for this. You're at Southwestern Seminary now. I think when we look at human depravity, it gives us insight as to why that will not work. So what I am talking about as sort of a third way is I'm not going to come and say, look, here's what you all need to do. You all do this, and we solve the problems. Because then I'm just, no matter what I say afterwards, I'm just as guilty as they are. I'm going to say what we need to do is learn how to communicate with each other in a healthy way, in a purposeful way, so that we can build on each other's ideas and solve problems that way, racial problems that way. And to me, that is more in keeping in line with the notion that we have human depravity, because now we can learn from other people our own weaknesses and move forward in that sense.
It's really good. I want to dig into each of these a little bit, and then I want to talk about your what you recommend. You talk about active listening. It's a really important way to bring people together. But the first thing you talk about is color blindness, and I think one of the things I really liked about the way you wrote about this is you come at a perspective of saying, I understand why people kind of talk this way. A lot of white evangelicals, well-meaning, will say, well, I don't see color. And I think what they mean is, I try not to discriminate based on the color of someone's skin. But what ends up coming out is that I don't see color. But when you look at Scripture, especially Revelation 5, Revelation 7, the Bible tends to portray our varied ethnicities as this sort of beautiful mosaic that God has created. And so to not see color is to not see someone how God made them. So explain why that kind of language is sometimes unhelpful.
Yeah, so, when you tell a person of color you don't see color, if you tell me you don't see color, first, I understand from what you just said that that's probably what you mean. But being an African American is part of my social identity. It's part of who I am. Now, I will be the first one to say it is not the most important part of who I am. I'm not saying that I'm Black before everything else, because I'm not. I'm a child of God before everything else. So I'm just going to be upfront about that. But I am also African American. It's a part of who I am. And so when you say you don't see color, what you're saying is that this is part of who you are. This important part, not the most important, but still an important part of who you are. I don't see it at all. I don't acknowledge it. It's not that important to me. So it sort of communicates to a person of color that an important part of who they are is just irrelevant to you. That they're not allowed to bring that to you. I think sometimes people don't understand what thare saying when they say, why are you all always bringing race into it? And while there are people who bring race into things just to cause a ruckus, gain power, what have you, most of the time when you bring race into it as an African American, it's just because that's who I am. and I'm revealing a little bit of myself to you. And so that becomes very, that becomes something that's hard for a person of color to hear, unless there's someone like me who's used to it and knows how to navigate those waters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it makes sense when you hear someone say that. I mean, I think in the one sense, I don't see color when it comes to, and you talk about this in the book, when it comes to actually the law. The law should be colorblind in some ways, in the sense that it shouldn't discriminate. I think is what you said. But the idea that we don't see someone in the full humanity the way that God created them is beautiful. I like the way that you talked about how that can be unhelpful. Let's talk about the other sort of unhelpful position that you described, anti-racism. I mean, on the surface, everybody would raise their hand and say, "Of course, I'm anti-racist." Yeah. No one, nobody wants to be known as pro-racist, right? But there is this kind of growing body of thinking, of literature, books. You think about Abraham Kendi's work and Robin DiAngelo and many others that are out there. That seems to be a departure from some of the typical civil rights sort of language. Explain why it's problematic for racial harmony and racial unity.
Yeah, I want to be colorblind too. I mean, we have these great terms. I don't want to pay attention to race, or I want to be anti-racist. I'm not. So it's sort of interesting the way we use these terms. So what does it mean to be anti-racist? Beyond just you're against racism. Well, I want to know what people actually thought when they said anti-racism. And so that's why I read, I read a lot of the anti-racism books that are out there. And that's where I pick up certain tenets of anti-racism. To be very proactive and deal with race, that race is a part of all facets of our society. And then what I've already mentioned before, that the role of whites is to do what people of color want them to do. And I think that's where it gets into all sorts of trouble. I would say that if all anti-racism is that we have to be very proactive and deal with race, and that race is very pernicious throughout our society, I would probably qualify myself as an anti-racist because I believe those things. But I know, and research has shown, that having this sort of attitude to say whites have to do what people of color want them to do does not help us. In fact, it can create backlash. It can create complacency. It actually can work against the stated goals of anti-racism. So, the research shows it does not work. And no matter how you feel about, maybe you read DiAngelo and you felt heard or something like that, you're a person of color. And I guess that's great for your feelings, but when it comes to whether actually doing this can actually make things better, it doesn't. And so we just have to acknowledge that that's just a reality. So what can we do to make things better is what we should be asking.
And, right now there's a lot of concern across the board about what is often labeled CRT. Obviously, there's a body of work, critical race theory. And I find the arguments or the conversations a little bit tedious as maybe you do. On the one hand, there is serious concern, I think, by parents and other folks about what is being taught in schools, and some of the anti-racism literature that you mentioned that can be harmful. That actually is harmful to racial unity and racial harmony. And on the other hand, sometimes I find folks, anytime you talk about racial reconciliation, racial unity, it gets labeled CRT. That's CRT work. So how do we break through some of these, the labeling and some of these things that happen where there is a genuine concern about CRT in some places, but then everything, every conversation about race gets labeled that, and it kind of shuts everything down. How are you finding ways to kind of transcend these sort of labels?
What I tell people is, look, if you have a problem with something in your school system, find out what it is and critique that. So let's say they're teaching white fragility, and you have a problem with white fragility. And I don't blame you. The concept as an academic term is not very useful. And, I think the arguments are very weak. That's fine. don't call it CRT. Say, I have a problem with the Angela being taught in my school because I have the such and such a problem with white fragility. That's accurate. And, I share your concern. When if we just say CRT to everything, then all of a sudden legitimate attempts to look at our history or legitimate attempts to address some of the racialized problems gets labeled CRT, and it's all lumped together. And that's that's the reason why the definition is important. Now, I will say that I just read an article the other day where Kendi says, yeah, CRT is good in our schools, and I think it's a little disingenuous for people to say, well, we don't have any CRT in our schools, which is technically the case, in that you're not getting Crenshaw and they're not reading Crenshaw or Bell or that's technically the case. But to say that CRT has not influenced some of what's been brought in school is disingenuous. So I think both sides are a little bit playing word games with us. And what I would rather us do is, let's just break down what's being done in the schools and then critique it on its own merits, rather than bring the CRT label to either defend or to use to plaster on everything.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that that's such a great approach, because there is genuine concern, and a lot of folks want to dismiss that. And then at the other hand, any genuine attempts for racial reconciliation is labeled certain things to shut it down. I think about that when I think about systemic racism. If you mention systemic racism, I feel like on the one hand, because of the influence of some of the anti-racism literature, every single thing is chalked up to systemic racism, which I think is unhelpful. And yet, as a Christian, we can have a concept of systemic sin, systemic racism. I mean, it's clear the system of chattel slavery was systemically racist, right? We could even say some of the other effects of Jim Crow and on down the line, redlining, those things were systemic racism. That this is possible, that we can believe in individual sin and culpability, but also that systems that are run by human beings can be sinful. And yet not every single problem can be chalked up to that. So you talk about that in the book, about how to navigate this concept of systemic racism. Are you finding that people are open to hearing things about this, and what do you recommend in this conversation?
Yeah, I guess it just depends on where they're at. I mean, some are and some are not. And part of it is, how do we talk to people in a way they can hear us? Because I think that's a key. I don't go into talks leading talking about white supremacy, because I know that turns people off right off the bat. I think it sometimes I'm successful in illustrating that, yeah, this is a real problem. Sometimes I'm not. I think that's the way it is for most individuals when you make an honest effort at communication. I think that for me, I like to use research because that's part of who I am as a scholar. And like one piece of research that I like to talk about is the fact that if what we call audit studies have been done on people applying for jobs. And we know that with these audit studies, which is basically having a white person and then either a black or a Hispanic person apply for a job, that the white person gets called back for the interview more than the black and Hispanic person. So we know that there's these difficulties out there. And there's other research out there. So I like to use research in order to sort of show this. And like I said, sometimes it's successful. If a person wants to learn about it, I think it usually is. If a person says, no, I'm not going to believe it no matter what, then there's something you can do.
One of the things that I really enjoy about your book is you encourage folks, it sounds so simple, but to listen to each other and to go into conversations about race with an open mind. Talk about why that's so important, and maybe explain what you mean when you talk about active listening.
Sure. So, we can listen to respond. Like if we're in debate, we're listening to respond. We're hearing them to sort of pull apart their arguments. And so there's a place for that, obviously. But I think we engage in too much of that type of listening when we deal with racial issues. We talk about an issue and we're listening so that we can know what our comeback's going to be. What I'm suggesting is let's listen to really hear where the person is coming from, to understand where the person is coming from, for the purpose, hopefully, of finding solutions for yourself and the other person. This traditionally kind of listened to called active listening. When I interviewed people as part of my research project, when I did the project on atheists, I actively listened. I wasn't looking to debate atheists. I was looking to debate them. But I wanted to understand why they believe what they believe and what is it they believe. That is the sort of attitude we're going to have to start developing. I call it an attitude of curiosity. I should be curious as to why you believe this thing that I don't believe. What's driving this? Because I'm going to have a good faith effort to say that there's some sort of sincere ideas that's driving when we disagree. And maybe you are right, maybe I'm wrong. But I want to have an attitude of curiosity, of listening in a way where I can hear what that person is saying and not place what I think they should be saying on there.
I think a lot of hesitation that folks have in entering conversation about racial reconciliation is that they won't be heard. Whether that they're going to go to this thing, and this is on all sides, I think, and they're just going to be lectured or talked down to or demeaned. These conversations are so highly charged, especially online, but in other forums, and there's so much literature, I think, on all sides that sort of sees someone who comes at it from a different perspective as the enemy. That there's just no incentive to sort of say, hey, wait a minute, I might learn something from this person, or hey, they made a good point, or maybe maybe there's a way to go, there's a way forward here. Do you think that kind of defensiveness is kind of an obstacle to some of these conversations, and how do we break that down?
Yeah, so clearly that's one of the problems, that we don't hear people out. We already have our defenses up, and so we can't understand where they're coming from. So that is clearly a problem. I think we need to change a mindset, that we're going to have to change our mindset. And we in the church should lead the way, but eventually we in the country have to change our mindset. So where we are talking to understand, to solve problems, we're talking to confront and to win some sort of battle. I think that, we're so, Danny, we're such a polarized society today. And race is just part of it, but it's a very polarizing society. So what are we going to do about it? We've got to break the cycle that we have of trying to fight people all the time and learn how to work together.
A couple more things. I know we're almost out of time. What I love about your book, Beyond Racial Gridlock, is that you do a lot of research in there, and you just talked about the surprising kind of data about some of our racial conversations. One of the things that was interesting to me is, I think in the wake of the George Floyd's murder and the protests, but maybe even a little bit before that, a lot of corporations, a lot of businesses really try to, I think well-meaning, try to help their employees understand racial issues. But some of those efforts, the DEI folks and whatever you found in your research, are actually counterproductive. Some of the trainings and those things. Why were those so counterproductive? In terms of helping people understand each other.
Well, I think sometimes what happens is that you get a sugar high. And, you get this training and you get excited. And you actually have less prejudice, but it doesn't last. It's a sugar high, and a few months later, things are back to normal. I just think the idea of having people try to train you out of racism in this day and age is very difficult to do. I think people have to sort of move at it on their own, and that's why I think conversation can help with that. But if we try to find mechanisms by which we, try to talk them out of it or have them read out of it, and convince them, feel like we have to convince them, then I think that's doomed to fail, because their own human depravity blinds them to reality. And then again, our human depravity. Do I have the right answers I'm trying to teach this person? You can't really be fully comfortable that you do. So I think that those are some of the factors that really limit what companies can do.
Yeah, I really think so too. And there's been a lot written about some of the nature of some of these trainings and some of the literature that's going in there.
Yeah.
sort of actually counterproductive, made people actually less inclined to talk to someone of a different race or befriend them.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting. Sometimes the well-meaning efforts are actually counterproductive. The last question I have is, if you're talking to a pastor or a church leader who wants to help foster racial reconciliation in their community, in their church, maybe they're a little nervous because there's so many landmines here. What advice would you give them? Obviously, besides read your excellent book, which I'm going to tell them, everybody, to go out and do. But what advice would you give a pastor or church leader trying to have these conversations, trying to, obey sort of the scriptures call to pursue racial reconciliation, but do it in a way that's God glorifying, biblical, and in a time when there's just so many landmines and we're so polarized?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of situations where this could take place. So let me take a situation where you have a pastor who has a passion for this, they have a congregation that is not. And for what I would suggest is something that we learned while we were studying multiracial churches. Now, some churches went from being monoracial to multiracial, and the pastor helped lead that. And what usually happened was that the pastor would work with a small group of leaders, their elders or board or just interested individuals, and work with them to cast a vision for them. And then once they had the vision, then those people would be his or her ambassadors. Southern Baptist, I guess should say his, right? That pastor, his ambassadors. And then those individuals will help that person as he tries to talk to the congregation about a different direction, about having better conversations. So that's an approach that I think I've seen it work for multiracial churches, to move a church to want to make the step towards becoming multiracial. I think it can work here. And then if your congregation is already on board, then to try to find avenues to have better racial conversations within and without the church. I think that's something that we need more and more Christians doing.
Well, it's such a good work, George. I really appreciate your work. I want to encourage folks to follow George Yancey to get his excellent book, Beyond Racial Division, a unifying alternative to colorblindness and AntiRacism. It's a very, very excellent book. I've recommended it numerous times and talked to a lot of church leaders who said it's found it very helpful. George, thanks for joining me today on the Way Home podcast.
Thank you.